Back in the 60s, my dad worked as a guard at a prison near Miami. He described his most memorable experience to me recently. He said that there was one prisoner who was a lot like a young Hannibal Lecter. Very calm, but very menacing. He always kept his cool no matter what, but there was something threatening about him. Well, one day, young Lecter was able to start a riot on his cell block, purely by motivating the other prisoners into a frenzy. He didn't participate in the riot at all, but he got every other prisoner to start a fit in their cell. My dad and a few other guards were called down to the cell block to quiet them all down. He says that when he got down there, every prisoner was screaming and throwing themselves against the walls of their cells, shouting profanity and insults to the guards. That is, every prisoner except Lecter. He was the only quiet one on the whole block. My dad came up close to his cell, and this guy was standing near the back with his hands folded, staring my dad directly in the eye, and muttering a random sequence of numbers with a strange smile on his face. My dad stood there, trying to figure out what the numbers meant, and then it finally hit him. The prisoner was reciting my dad's home phone number on repeat. Number 4.
I was a correctional officer at a Supermax prison for about 9 months. We had these things at the prison called mini yards. Pretty much fenced enclosures with a basketball hoop, and a concrete floor that were attached to the galleries and separated from the main yard. At 8:15 the inmates would lock down, and by 9 we had our count for the evening. After that count, no one was allowed to leave their cell until 4, when workers were let out to the kitchen. My first time working the night, I was sitting in the control center when the computer started pinging that someone had pushed the intercom button on the outside of the mini yard. This of course freaked me out, seeing as how I had not let anyone out there, and anyone who would want to get in from the outside would have to climb through 3 rows of razor wire. I brought up the camera feed, hoping maybe a maintenance guy for some reason had used a key to get in from the outside. There was nothing out there. I assumed it was a computer glitch and cleared the call. It immediately rung again, still nothing on the camera feed. The button that was being pushed was used by the inmates to let us in the control center know that they wanted to come inside. There is also a speaker by the button that we can use to talk to them. I selected the intercom and spoke into, asking who was there. No answer. I decided I should call my lieutenant. At the least, this was a serious glitch that needed to be fixed. And at the worst, it was someone who had managed to stay out on the mini yard hours after lockdown and was messing with me. So I called him and reported it, and all he said was, "Yeah, that happens. Just open the intercom and tell them that the mini yard is closed," and then hung up. So I opened the intercom to the seemingly empty mini yard and say, "Sorry, the mini yard is closed," in the same way I would tell the actual inmates on the day shift. Lo and behold, it stops ringing in. Another time, this guy was working video monitoring at around 9 p.m. when he saw something moving out in a nearby cornfield. He pans the camera and zooms in on it, and sees a black dog thing walking through the cornfield. Then, as he is about to pan the camera back to its original spot, the thing stands up on its 2 hind legs and sprints across the cornfield towards the tree line. I called bullshit, but since the video monitoring saves all its feed for 30 days, I was able to watch it during training with the guy.
Number 3. Johnny R. came into our jail one night, ranting and raving, screaming he was cursed by the voodoo man. Not so unusual here, but Johnny R. was wearing a very nice suit, and in his wallet were signs of living a normal life. Non-expired ID, gold Amex card in his name, and around $100 in cash. Because of his psychotic state, he went into isolation. Days went by. He wouldn't make a phone call, wouldn't eat or drink, continued to constantly yell at everyone to call the voodoo man in Miami and pay the money. Mental health and medical personnel monitored him. We even sent him out to the hospital, but none of the experts could tell us anything other than he's having a psychotic break. Antipsychotic drugs seem to have little effect except to increase his ranting. Another week goes by. No one calls about the guy. We find out he was an executive working at a local bank. His employers told us he was a great employee. He'd been arrested for standing on a corner downtown, screaming and spitting, and when officers tried to take him into custody to transport him to a mental health facility, he fought and battered the officers. He lost weight rapidly. He was a well-built man, about 6'2" and 220 pounds when he came in. Within the 2 weeks we had him, he was down to 160. He was dark-complected, but his skin looked gray and kind of hung on him. And the smell, really the smell. You could smell him on the whole floor. And it was like nothing you had ever smelled before. Not quite decay, not quite gangrene, not quite vomit or feces, but all that rolled together in a roiling funk that traveled extensively, with a strange edge of spiciness, kind of like hot sauce. No idea why I remember it so well, but I've never smelled anyone like him before or since. The thing is, the few times he was semi-lucid, you could tell he was an okay guy. He'd plead with you to call Miami and pay the man using his Amex, but he didn't have the man's number. He said it was in his wallet. We looked, but never found it. On a Saturday morning, our watch commander got a phone call from someone claiming to be Johnny R's mother. She was excited to have found him and told the commander they would drive to our facility tomorrow to get him. In a thick Haitian accent, she said they'd paid the voodoo man and he would be okay now. Could they possibly bond him out and take him back to Miami on Sunday? His mother explained what had happened prior to Johnny's arrest. On vacation from his bank job, he went back to Miami to be with family. While there, he wanted to get in touch with his Haitian roots. He was born in Florida, but felt a need to get in touch with where he came from. So he attended a voodoo ceremony, got scared, wanted to leave, and was cursed by a voodoo man who said he would become a zombie if the voodoo man was not paid a certain amount of money in a specified time. Johnny didn't think much of that threat, and despite the warnings from his family, laughed it off and went back to work. The day the debt remained unpaid, his descent began. We worked with the judge and the arresting officers to get the charges dropped if the family took him home. I went up to his isolation cell to tell him his family was coming to get him. No smell. At all. And his color was back. He was still thin, but was sitting on his bunk, eating lunch and completely lucid. He was delighted and told me he knew his family was coming, because he knew the man had been paid. Sunday, his whole family, about 7 of them, came to the jail to get him, dressed in their church clothes. I talked with his mother, a delightful lady in a light yellow skirted suit, wearing a fabulous feathered hat. She thanked me for helping her son, and as he walked out in his wrinkled suit, a rope holding up his sagging pants, she told me, "You have to pay the voodoo man. He should have known that."
Number 2.
I am a female corrections officer, prison guard or CO, in a state with a relatively high number of death row inmates. However, few executions are actually carried out. I used to work for a large county, but I work for a different agency now. This county was my first CO job years ago, and before that I had worked in retail and customer service while studying criminal justice, so I was really green. I used to be very liberal. I'm still liberal about a lot of things, but the job does change your perspective for most people. One thing that I used to believe in very strongly was that no human being could be truly evil. This particular county jail is one of the oldest in the country, so parts of it have a total liner layout. What I mean is that you have a long stretch of corridor with cells on either side, and the COs have to walk up and down to supervise the inmates. I am actually giving enough information for anyone with good Google FU skills to figure out a lot. As you can imagine, these liner layouts are not in style anymore, because you cannot see every cell at the same time, but every inmate can see you. I have to say that units like this are extremely creepy too. I am going to call this corridor the condos. We did not call it that, but I do not want to share the exact term which is specific to this jail. Less than 10 years ago, a quadruple stabbing homicide happened not far from where I grew up. The murderer, Michaels, described it as a butchering. and he killed his former girlfriend, her family, and their neighbor because he came over when he heard the screams. When the police found Michael soaked in blood and asked him what happened, he said, "It's obvious. I just killed everyone." The cops said that he seemed completely emotionless when he said it. At that time, I had only been a CO for about 4 months, and our facility received him as a pretrial detainee. Now, obviously he wasn't our first or only murder, but the nature of the crime and his lack of remorse was horrifying. He was considered a volatile inmate, so we placed him in an observation cell in the middle of the condos, where a CO could always keep an eye on him. He would stand at his glass door in silence most of the day, just watching everyone. I swear he only spoke when he had visits. He actually had a full visits list of these big goth girls who would come in and swear they were in love with him. I don't know if this means anything, but his ex was a big girl, and he used to draw pictures of the fat female COs. For note, he was skinny and white with brown hair. One day, I was working as a utilities officer, basically a floater who relieves people for breaks and helps out as needed. At this jail, utilities officers also got away with a ton of downtime and bullshitting. I was hanging out at one of the condos where you could look down and see a lot of the jail, talking to another officer on duty. As they say, there are no secrets in jail. Plus, I was aware that there were points throughout the jail where you could hear very well into neighboring cells. That sort of thing. We were being pretty quiet though. Plus, we stood a good 50 yards from Michael's observation cell. Also, you have to imagine it would be difficult to stand in the observation cell and press your face against the glass to see people, standing at a right angle so far from you. I was telling the other CO a funny story about my weekend, which I wouldn't do out on a correctional unit nowadays. But we weren't getting into anything too personal either. It was a long story involving my fiance at the time. I wrapped up talking to this CO because I had to go to a gate to relieve another officer for chow, and I had to pass Michael's cell. I didn't like walking past it because he stood there and stared at you. And back then I wasn't so good at hiding my nervousness. He always had his head slightly tilted down so you could see white under the irises of his eyes. Again, rarely ever saying a word. But today was different. I took one step past his door and I heard him say, "Edgecombe," in a barely audible whisper. I didn't even know he knew my name. Yes, our last names are on our uniforms, but I was never his primary officer, and we'd never interacted. It caught me off guard, so instead of ignoring it, it stopped me in my tracks and I backpedaled to the door. He pointed to his mouth, and I leaned in to listen. His eyes looked so dark. I remember I felt hypnotized. He proceeded to recite word for word the story I had just quietly told the other officer at the end of the condos, less than 2 minutes before, even copying the sound of my voice down to the subtle lisp. This seemed to go on forever. I felt like we were the only two there. No 22 millimeters of glass protecting me, just a 5-foot-tall female and a murderer. I remember thinking for the first time of another human being. This is evil and unfixable. Finally, I said, "Sir, you need something?" He started to laugh hysterically, and I walked away. I have been assaulted by other inmates. I have had piss thrown in my eyes. People play mind games with me constantly. I've met some damn good lip readers too, but this was like something else. Now I work at a maximum security institution where I babysit all rapists and murderers and pedophiles. I don't know how to make it make sense to you that this was the one and only time in my life where I felt inside of me like I was dealing with something not human. Michaels is in another institution now. He is on death row. He refuses to appeal. He made it clear to the press that this decision is not out of remorse. He has none. He just doesn't give a shit, and it is most logical in his mind for him to die. Inmate Michaels, if you ever do get out somehow, please, let's never meet again.
Number 1.
The jail I was in had some converted actual houses for short-timers, called sweepers, no idea why, to stay in. That's where I stayed. Long-timers go to the barracks. 9 p.m., Christmas Eve. Fully dark outside, and some long-timers are starting to gather quietly around our house full of short-timers. There's a guy that looks like a 300-pound biker. An arsonist almost completely covered in burn scars. Seriously, I asked him what he was in for. and some of the nastiest, toughest looking guys I've ever seen. Some of the guys in our house weren't small, but we're all starting to look a bit nervous. Something is about to happen, and we can't see the guards. The houses are all surrounded by 7-foot-high steel fences. Suddenly, the big guys start silently coming in and gather around a tree in the front. Some sugar gliders, Australian flying squirrels, come climbing down the tree trunk. These guys all magically produce bread chunks and snacks from their pockets and spend the next hour gently hand-feeding these squirrels. I couldn't believe it, and I said so to my mate. Note that these are some of the same guys who, after a day working in the kitchen, the knives must be counted and locked in the large walk-in deep freeze, because if they aren't, or one goes missing, it usually turns up inside someone. Hey guys, I know that last story wasn't really scary, but I figured with Christmas right around the corner, it fit well. I want to give a big thank you to my friend Southern Cannibal for helping me out with this video. On the off chance that you don't know who he is, there's an annotation on screen and also a link in the description. I highly recommend you check out his channel, and while you're there, be sure to abuse all available like and share buttons. Well guys, I just wanted to say, I started this channel 5 months ago, with no real expectations, and I never could have imagined the amount of love and support I've received from you guys. It's still surreal to me every day. So on that note, I want to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a great 2017. And to all my colleagues on the horror narration side of the YouTube community, may 2017 be our best year yet. Thank you all for all the love and support, and I'll see you in the next one.